sounded like my performance review, so I'll take note that things are obviously going well. Before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge traditional custodians of land where we are, and anyone in the room who's an Indigenous Australian or those joining online. So, authenticity. I'll cover a few things today, but it's the word that struck me many times over many years, and what that means for me, for my practice as an individual, as a professional, and then also as our students who we spend some time with. Before I go any further, as indicated, I've been CRADLE Fellow for a couple of years now. I want to formally acknowledge Margaret's tremendous work. It made me think very deeply and critically about the topic. Roller as well. I don't know if Roller joins these online with the time difference, but if Roller's here listening or listens to the recording, I want to acknowledge Roller's tremendous work as well, early on before she moved to UBC. And Caradon, my research fellow, now collaborator on all of this work, has spent an inordinate amount of time listening to me ramble on about authenticity in psychology, and it's been really fruitful. So I just want to really acknowledge these individuals and the tremendous role they've played in helping me get to this point today. So what do I plan to cover with you? These 4 points. First, and I should clarify and qualify, for those in the room, particularly CRADLE folk, you will have seen some of this already. So given it's the afternoon session post-lunch, if you do relax and rest your eyes, I won't take offence to it. For those who haven't seen this before, hopefully it's invigorating for you. First, I want to challenge what we mean by authentic assessments, and then explore a particular type of what I'm calling psychological authenticity and how that fits within it. I'll then talk about some CRADLE findings. I've got findings from a sort of a pre-ish CRADLE project and then the main project, and want to leave you with what's next, what's to come. Before I do that, though, I want to start with this. Aurora is one of the participants in my main project, and I share this here and now because this is my day-to-day bread and butter in the classroom. I've been teaching first-year psychology for over 15, near 20 years now, and we see this frequently. The students typically transitioning out of high school into tertiary education, I will be a clinical psychologist. It's admirable, but at a place like Deakin, when we have over 2,500 other first-year students who also want to become clinical psychologists, you can imagine that there is quite some restriction in terms of who makes it and who doesn't. But so strong are these identities, these professional identities, and when you consider the time nature here, from year 7, they're really tightly bound to this idea, many of them, that they want to be someone, typically a clinical psychologist. I don't know anyone in the room and online if you remember what you were doing in year 7, but I certainly had no strong sense of who I was going to become in year 7. I was probably just surviving the year. But as you can tell by this, and there are many instances where these students are very keen and wedded to the idea of who they will become in a professional identity. So that's kind of the backdrop to how I've come to approach this particular topic. Thanks, Juan. Okay, so there are luminaries in the field and online. You'll be well versed in this literature, more so than myself. But for those who are perhaps dabbling in it for the first time, there's a tremendous amount of literature that's dedicated to what might be conceptualized as more of a traditional authentic assessment design. These I've showcased and I've pulled out, not to say that these are the best. These are perhaps the ones I leaned on the most early on in my fellowship. There were plenty others that I drew upon, but these are the ones that perhaps resonated with me the most. Much has been said about authentic assessment. There's many notable strengths to that particular approach, but what really struck me in my early reading was the idea that the traditional authentic assessment that might replicate the real world and a student completes that task doesn't really create an opportunity for the student to develop themselves. They fail to engage the whole student in that traditional authentic assessment sense. So I approached this area with an idea that we need to better understand developmental educational processes that enable students to be more authentic in their learning journeys. More recently, there have been some fantastic publications that have actually really tried to challenge this status quo. And I'm not just saying this because the Cradle folk are in the room and I'm giving a seminar series here, but some of their work, I think, has helped broaden our perspectives and helped us recognize that if we decouple authenticity from assessment, it provides us with more opportunities. So shifting away from this task, product, outcome-focused idea of authentic assessment to something that's a bit more nuanced and actually then allows us to focus on the idea of what is authenticity, provides us with these opportunities to do so. On the screen, the bottom editorial, Roller and team, I think have done this quite nicely, suggesting that if we focus on the idea of authenticity as an emergent process, it can enable our students to take some sort of control over the learning journey and their futures, rather than just doing an assessment task that someone in a unit thinks replicates the real world. So there's an idea that this kind of decoupling authenticity from assessment might allow us to design tasks that promote deeper engagement for our students. So where I started honing a little bit more was this idea of psychological authenticity. These three perspectives come from the CRADLE 2024 paper about trying to decouple authenticity, and puts forward these three ones. Psychological authenticity, the one that I'm leveraging because it's most closely aligned to my discipline background of psychology, suggests that we make these internal reference points, that as an individual, as a student, I make a judgment about, is this of value to me in the context of an assessment task? And then that might dictate how much effort or motivation I might put into that task versus something that is perhaps of lesser value. Ontological fidelity, the idea that performing a task engages individuals' aspirations, and then complex social practice, about having genuine dialogue about the varied meaning and these purposes of the tasks. For me, this is where I found my time, in psychological authenticity. So I really wanted to challenge what that looked like. Diving deeper into it, I came to the view that there were two elements to it: authentic cognitions, and on a subsequent slide, I'll talk about authentic behaviours. With respect to these authentic cognitions, I think that authenticity, and when I say I think, I mean based on my assessment of the literature, authenticity, it's certainly valued, but it is difficult to interrogate. And that's one of the criticisms, particularly with authentic assessment more broadly. How do we actually define authenticity in that context? So this kind of idea about authentic cognitions suggests that we do appraise our values against a point of reference. In the context of higher education, it might be, as a student, do I value a research or a laboratory report? And if so, because that might align with my professional identity, then yes, I might put more effort into it, might be more motivated, compared to a task that is less so. We then use different lenses to inform our judgment. And this suggests that authenticity in this context is no longer binary. It's not something is authentic, and therefore if it's not authentic, it is inauthentic. But through these lenses, authenticity can blur and fluctuate. There we go. Subsequent to that, once the student has made that assessment, valued judgment, there's the idea of authentic behaviours, what they do, their actions. So in this case, authentic behaviours might suggest that they're making decisions and therefore actions that are consistent with their sense of self, that they're endorsed by their self. Their self-narrative as an individual, there's congruence between what they're doing and that self-narrative. So the idea that these actions are genuine and they're congruent. And it's this coherence or this congruence between the values and their actions towards a task that's critical to this idea of authentic behaviours. So in this case, behaviour is this narrative, and we develop our coherence through it. Behaviours then, based on self-determined motivation, can be mapped onto these different subtypes: external regulation, intrinsic motivation. I then asked my friend Copilot to design me what would this look like for different students according to these different types of self-regulation. I figured it couldn't be a Cradle thing without some sort of reference to Gen AI and Thomas. I had you in the back of my mind. It's like, what could I do? So external regulation might look like this for a first-year psych student who is solely motivated by just getting a grade, that external carrot in front of them in order to make it through perhaps into postgraduate qualifications. Introjected regulation, someone who's motivated in this regard might feel a nagging sense of guilt whenever they procrastinate on their assessment, and that guilt then becomes the motivator for them to do the task. Someone who is motivated in a more identified or an integrated way might be motivated to complete an assessment task because they perceive it as something of value towards a particular vocation. For example, in psychology, a student who does a case analysis on a fictitious kind of scenario might think, oh, this is what a clinical psychologist will do. So I'm more motivated to do it because I want to be a clinical psychologist. There is some tangible outcome that they've identified. With respect to integrated regulation, then that might look along the lines of, I value being a social psychologist or a clinical psychologist or a forensic psychologist. And so with that value alignment integrated within the belief value system, they're motivated to complete the task. Someone who is purely intrinsically motivated might be motivated to complete a task because of a sense of joy. They're just inherently curious about all of the assessment tasks, which we said at the lunch break, in an undergraduate course probably is a bit unrealistic. Across 24 units, X number of assessments, are they going to be intrinsically motivated across all of them? Probably not. The point I'm trying to make is this, that across the assessments that a student might undertake, their motivation will fluctuate dependent on their values, and the behaviours that they exhibit in relation to completing those assessment tasks will vary according to this sort of sliding scale of subtypes of self-determined motivation. Some, you might just be motivated to get a mark, to get it done. Others, you might feel guilty. Perhaps it's group work and you haven't done your piece. Others, you might just have a real love or a joy of the subject area. So the motivation can vary. And the point is that all of these different types can be authentic to the self. So it's not a case of it's authentic or inauthentic. They can all be perceived as being authentic. The backdrop to all of this is the first year experience. As I've said, I spent all of my teaching largely focused on first year students, typically transitioning in, a lot of first and family, English as second language, and there are numerous challenges that these students face. There's the expectation of how they'll perform. In particular in Victoria, a number of our students, they study psychology in VCE, so year 11, year 12. They have a very strong sense of what they think psychology is. They might have done particularly well at high school. They come to university with strong expectations of maintaining that level of performance. Sometimes the expectations don't meet the reality. There are also institutional factors. Deakin is large. Our first year units have in excess of 1,500, 2,000 students. So operating at scale makes this more challenging for some students. Then there are some negative health outcomes associated with this. We know that mental health challenges are on the rise. We know that there's assessment shock. Phil has a paper on that. These present as difficulties that the students have to overcome. So this work led to this particular bit of almost pilot work. So in this study that's published in the Teaching Higher Ed special issue, I looked at my unit that I teach at Deakin University, which is an introduction to health behaviour unit, and we asked students questions along the lines of the meaning and value of these assessment tasks. There's more in the paper, but largely the assessment tasks were a reflective journal about their self-determined health behaviour. Do you want to increase your exercise? Do you want to decrease your exercise? Improve your sleep, so on and so forth. They had choice in what they wanted to do. From that, in analysing the data, there were two key themes that came out from it. First and foremost was that the assessments in that particular unit were a catalyst for the individual's self-reflection. They learned new tools, they picked up some processes along the way, but predominantly they were able to reflect and introspect on their behaviour and whether they really value that. Second to that, it wasn't just a pretty picture. There were some students who actually would game the system in the sense that they were motivated by external or extrinsic factors. So if we take a bit more of a deep dive into this, this is some of the data that I've already presented elsewhere. So if you've seen this before, you can lean back and shut your eyes for a moment. But what I wanted to share is in terms of helping students find meaning and value in some of these tasks in just one undergraduate unit, the quotes, I think, do a nice job of unpacking what this looks like for students. An assessment task forcing them to look at what they were doing, reflect upon my own behaviours, what I valued as an individual. It's a framework for self-analysis and allowed more meaningful introspection. As assessment tasks, and I can't take credit for them, they were designed before I came into the unit, but as assessment tasks in this unit in first year, they presented as a really nice opportunity for students to consider their values as an individual. Do I value my health? Do I not value my health? Am I just doing this because it's a first year unit and I need the credit point? Or am I actually going to use this as an opportunity as I'm transitioning from typically secondary into tertiary education? So they were this catalyst for self-reflection. Many of the students who were involved in this study found that they actually benefited. This particular one said they were down about their health, and I should say the caveat to this data was collected during the tail end of COVID. So there was a lot of opportunity for some students to self-reflect when they couldn't get out for more than an hour at a time. But it helped them change their daily routine. So there's a shift, there's an evolution of the sense of self for some of these students. Others proclaimed that it changed their life for the better. They helped move away from the poor me attitude and take responsibility for themselves, and their outlooks changed on a more global level. So again, the point is that these assessment tasks provided students with an opportunity to reflect on what they valued, and then they could engage with them, or, as some said, they just completed what they thought was necessary to pass the unit. So in these students' cases, whilst they were the minority, there were a certain number of students who said, I just wrote what I thought would be sufficient to get me a mark to pass. There's that external regulation piece. I'm only motivated for a mark. I see no inherent value in this for me as a person. I'm just doing it to pass, to get a mark. So what we have with these assessment tasks is some evidence of the ranges of motivation that students have when completing these tasks. Some found value in them, and the broader data would suggest that maybe they were a little bit more intrinsically motivated. They might have identified a bit more meaning and value in it compared to others. But that little bit of a pilot study led to my main CRADLE project. And what I wanted to do was look more broadly. That previous piece of work was just in my unit on health behaviour. I want to look across first year. At Deakin, we have 6 core first year psychology units, various array of assessment tasks. And so I wanted to ask students, what resonated with you, if anything, hopefully something. So we asked them what resonated and what are the implications of undertaking these tasks, particularly around this idea of the professional identity. Given I said at the start, many come in with this idea of I will be a clinical psychologist. So what we have were these two themes. The first one speaks towards the task itself. What I've called traditional psychology assessment tasks, these resonated the most with students, but for unexpected reasons. I say unexpected because as someone who's worked in this space for a long time now, I was surprised. I was genuinely surprised. And so when I was talking these results through with Margaret, I think the essence of the feedback I got was just sit with that tension and process it, because it's not what I expected. And not that we would have hypotheses in a qualitative project. It certainly caught me off guard in the sense that students were doing these things for various reasons, but different to what I assumed. The second theme speaks towards the function of these tasks, that they fundamentally destabilize students by challenging these professional identities. So for the students who come in thinking, I will be a clinical psychologist, they hit these traditional tasks and their foundations have been shaken. So what does this look like? I'll pause. I'll recognize that I've done the faux pas of I've got so much text on a slide. I hate this as an educator. I should know better, but I also like the context of the quote. So excuse the heavy text. What does this look like? For the traditional assessment tasks, the first and foremost question is, what do these look like? In psychology, laboratory reports, research reports, and some sort of case study or case analysis, where the students are given a fictitious case study and it's their first opportunity to maybe have a glimpse in terms of what is it like to be a practitioner. There's a lot of guardrails and a lot of boundaries imposed on these students, but in first year, they quite like it. And as the data supports, they really enjoy spending time understanding what it's like to have a go at these case assessments. In terms of analysing the data, there was a real split as well. We have these traditional assessment tasks, the lab reports, the research reports, the case analyses, and then we have all of these other assessment tasks that as educators we've designed because that's what we thought students wanted. So we have these fantastic career plans, job searches, group work, because we all know that students love group work, data analysis, data extraction assessment tasks to try and provide opportunities to acquire new and diverse skills. Turns out they don't like them that much. First rule of being unexpected. Other key things that we found, I guess if I put the reflection hat on, knowing that so many of these students come into this course having studied psychology, typically in VC year 11, 12 at high school, I was of the view that maybe they're kind of bored with them. The research report, the lab report, maybe less over the case study because they don't typically get that. But lo and behold, they actually really enjoyed it. Those are the ones that actually resonated with them the most, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. One of the reasons that we found they resonated the most was it just encouraged this greater sense of deep reflection. Students, it's almost like they came out of high school thinking, oh, that was a nice little taster. I want some of that more of the same. So us as educators held the view that it was like, oh, it's repetition. You've probably done that. You need the skills. You need to write a research report, but you've probably done these at length. And so often in practice, we would come up with interesting topics to try and engage them. Over the years, it's been things like Facebook, social media use, wellbeing is a popular topic, drug and alcohol use, catchy topics that they would write up in a research report to try and gain their interest. Turns out it's less about the topic and more about the actual task, completing it, that resonated. Joe's reaction was very much like mine. I was completely surprised. So in being able to reflect deeply about these tasks, that's what mattered to the students, more so than some of those other what we thought were fancy tasks. So you can see in this particular quote here by Arvid, as a student who didn't have such a strong sense of I will be a clinical psychologist, Arvid was someone who was happily open-minded in terms of where they might go. As soon as they got to the case analysis, this was interesting. I want more of that. The other assessment tasks that I've already flagged included things like the career plan. So in response to a couple of directives through Deakin, a lot of our first year teaching team have tried to introduce career planning, job search skills, resume building as a way to try and diversify student skill sets. More often than not, these students found these disinteresting. You can see Yara here in her assessment task where she was looking for jobs on Seek and Indeed. It's a lovely job, but it's not what I'm interested in. And in fact, it actually did the opposite. It reaffirmed I'm here to become a clinical psychologist because I know I don't want to do that job. So rather than confirming, oh, there's other opportunities I can do with my psych degree, it's like I don't want to do anything else with my psych degree except become my clinical psychologist. With Aurora down the bottom, doing a cover letter, it was good because I got me my current job, but I see no real benefit beyond that. So it's a very contextualized assessment task rather than actually using it as an opportunity to perhaps embed some broader skills. So rather than using these tasks to help students look beyond psychology, largely what they served is to reinforce that I want to stay in psychology, which is, there's some chuckles in the room that might not be picked up online. That's maybe a good sell for us as a discipline, but it's not really helping the 1,950 students who won't get into postgraduate studies. So this leads me on to the second thing, what the assessment tasks did in terms of their function. We found that they really did destabilize students. While they had this, while many of them had previous experience with doing laboratory reports, some with case analysis, particularly if they fell into that mature age student sort of category, they still struggled with these tasks. So despite having done numerous of these laboratory reports in high school, they still struggled with them. And this was a really challenging finding for me to try and unpack. And so hopefully I'll articulate it well to you today. Why is this the case? Sometimes it was a case that the student professional identity was so tightly bound for that individual that they struggled to try and see beyond it, in the sense that Yara here, she would always advocate for psychology as a science. It's a real thing. It's not just sort of some flaky discipline area. And then when she was confronted with these assessment tasks, oh, they're really hard. So there's that real lived experience of like, it is hard. I've actually found it really challenging. And then when, and I should flag that CC Carradine did all of the interviews, there was this, when prompted to think more about it, it's like, you know, there were others who were struggling with this as well, who also had a strong sense of belief around, I will be a psychologist, or that's certainly the field I want to go. But that collective sense of like, oh, we were all struggling. Can we actually do this as a piece of work? So even though there were students who had this experience with lab reports in the past, they still fundamentally struggled with the work. Slightly different take is, Annika, you can see on the bottom left, why are we doing statistics? I thought psychology was about listening to people. And that speaks to almost another narrative that's evident across the data set, where there's these mismatches between what students expect psychology to look like and the actual reality, where anyone who might know a little bit about an undergraduate psychology degree, it's very unlikely that you'll have any kind of opportunity to do any form of interactive work, client type work. That's certainly changing, and you will have degrees like at Deakin where we embed some counselling skills, but largely it's not typically there. Yet students like Annika will come in thinking that I don't need to do statistics. I'm here to talk, to listen. Where's the therapeutical element? They struggle with that. So they have these really strong professional identities that are challenged when faced with research reports that have statistics that they have to interpret and then write up. So for them, there's this little fundamental disconnect. And the point that I need to make here is this dissonance, where students have these really strong views of what psychology is to them, are being challenged by these assessment tasks. And what might not be conveyed necessarily in some of these quotes, but certainly across the data set, the dissonance was accompanied by this really strong emotional reaction. Students were stressed. Students were overwhelmed. Students were having these very strong, almost visceral type emotional reactions to the assessment tasks, predominantly because they were not matching their expectations. The reality was quite different. In terms of the implications of these assessment tasks that challenge the students and destabilise them, there were some elements of overcoming, some positive outcomes, where students did report things like sense of pride, sense of accomplishment, and more confident in their work. It was almost like this quest or journey that they had been through, and as a consequence of it, they actually felt some kind of validation, like, maybe I can become that psychologist because I can do this assessment task that I didn't think was necessary for this particular course. But that wasn't common for everyone. Some students, like Talia, felt less capable. And Amani really questioned, why am I here? Am I doing it right? If I don't like laboratory reports, and they seem to be so fundamental to psychology, why should I be doing this? And Amani was a lovely participant in the sense that came into the interview with a really lovely description of how they really appreciated the interaction with the teaching team, loved working with other students. So there's a real sense of building those therapeutical skills, but then was confronted with the laboratory report. I thought, that's not what psychology is. Why am I doing laboratory reports, research reports? Where's all the practitioner work? So rather than it becoming enjoyable, it became a little bit more of a questioning exercise. So what does all this mean? And I've gone quite light touch on the data because I kind of want to spend a little bit of time on what this all means. You might be sitting there in the room online thinking, well, how does this all relate to authenticity? Where's the authenticity piece in it? If it's not evident for you, let me try and see if I can help you with that. It dawned on me just a couple of days ago, a comment that Dave, you made last year about my project. And it struck me, it's like, am I not just presenting what is a traditional authentic assessment, a research report that an academic thinks what happens in industry that we're getting students to do? Have I not just reinvented the wheel largely? And there was an element of that, but I think there's also a point of difference here because this is largely about the student's point of view and perspective, the student's dissonance that they exhibited when undertaking these assessment tasks. For some students, and I should pause and say I won't go so far as to say how those different subtypes of self-determined motivation might map onto these different student experiences, but I think we can see aspects of those elements of self-determined motivation within the students' experiences. Certainly, there are a number of cases where integrated motivation, where there's an alignment between one's values and the task is evident. And I think there are some, sorry, I just saw the comment, when's university ever enjoyable? I'm enjoying myself now, if that helps. Can't speak for my students all the time. I think there's enough evidence so far to suggest that there is some degree of students appraising these assessment tasks, considering how well they align with their personal values, and then they are completing them. So there's some degree of motivation, whether that motivation is externally regulated in terms of they're just there for the mark, or what I think we saw a little bit more in our data set, there's this idea of, well, this assessment task is maybe what a psychologist does. So it has to align with my values because I want to become a psychologist. And so maybe they are a little bit more towards the end of intrinsic motivation, elements of that integrated motivation. I also think that even if these traditional assessments in psychology are the ones that resonate with students the most, it seems worthwhile that we do them here and now in first year. Because imagine a different scenario where they don't get this kind of struggle, where they don't get the experience of this sense of dissonance until third year. That leaves them with very little opportunity to then grapple with that and go to the next step. So it seems critical that they experience this, as challenging as it is, in first year so they can go through this transformational process, if you want to call it that. where they're forced to consider this emerging professional identity and how that sits against these assessment tasks. And if I make a link back to that editorial that Roller and colleagues wrote, we do need to give students the opportunity to consider their future trajectories. So doing that in first year does seem like the opportune time, as opposed to leaving it much later. As for those other assessment tasks, the career planning, the resume ones, perhaps they are less important in first year. Maybe they could move a little further later in the course sequencing. But what would we replace them with? And when I was chatting with Margaret and Cece about this, perhaps it's a common problem that in first year students try and tackle that could be looked at from different discipline points of view. So maybe you introduce the problem and then maybe you do tackle it from psychology, psychological sciences, but maybe you also look at it from social work. Maybe there are other domains or disciplines that you might want to consider in order to help students build an understanding and a knowledge of what psychology is and what it is not. So rather than having to pick a career or vocation in first year, they're introduced to those other vocational areas, and then perhaps later on in the track, they might consider some of these. I should confess, I haven't actually told my school these ideas yet, so we'll wait and see what actually happens with that. So I think those other assessment tasks have value, but it's the timing of them that maybe needs more consideration. Second reflection thing to consider is that I think there's value in better understanding students' experience of authenticity. This idea of decoupling authenticity from assessments is quite new. So perhaps spending a little bit more time understanding this space and ideally outside of the discipline of psychology would add value. Psychology is a non-vocational discipline. Perhaps this looks different in other discipline areas that have a much tighter vocational outcome for students. What would this look like for nursing midwifery students compared to psychology students, as an example? So related points include things like if we do try and broaden our scope across other discipline areas, what would it look like in terms of engagement in vocational perhaps versus non-vocational? As a final point to consider, I want to pick up on Tim Fawn's paper that came out as a consequence of the 2023 symposium that authentic assessment's not a panacea. And I certainly think that my data would support that in some small way. But I also think we don't need to throw out authentic assessment as a whole, because some of my colleagues in psychology might contest that, well, a research report is an authentic assessment or a case study is an authentic assessment. And then what I'm positioning is that perhaps there is authenticity in those tasks that the students are actually identifying meaning and value in. So short story is that I think more needs to be done in order to better understand what authenticity in assessment looks like. There's a lot more work that's in the special issue of Teaching in Higher Ed that really goes to this in greater depth. But I feel encouraged. I feel encouraged that we don't need to completely dismiss authentic assessment altogether. We can actually hold on to elements of it, but just better interrogate it some more. All right. Final points or reflection from me. Just again, wanted to thank CRADLE for the opportunity. As we were reflecting at lunch, I felt in the early days like I was a PhD student again. So really loved being challenged in terms of some deep metacognitive work, but have thoroughly enjoyed my time. And as I said to Phil during the break, who's hopefully listening online, it's really provided me with the spark to continue more work in this space. So thanks to Margaret and Cece for their work and to CRADLE more broadly for the opportunity. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Phil, for the hat tip online. I can see it. Thank you so much, Tim. And it was really lovely to revisit that body of work, and to also revisit that surprise when we got the data come in. We went, oh, that's not quite what we were anticipating. So let me start off by opening up to questions. I think, Jack, you're fielding for online, and also, of course, we've got questions in the room. Anyone got questions in the room? Let me open first. Dave.
Yeah, I think this is a simple one, but one of the things that's going through my mind is authentic to who throughout your presentation. And you kept giving illustrations of these dedicated psych students that wanted to be psychologists. But surely your unit is a service unit to endless number of other degrees. And the majority of the students wouldn't have these aspirations to be psychologists. Did you see any differences between the kind of hard line, dedicated identity possessing of psychology with these others that wouldn't have had that expectation?
In a word, yes, it's a great question. I think there are narratives in the data set that suggest there's a strong element of we have aspirational psychologists, and maybe that's why they volunteered for the study. So maybe there's a bit of bias in the data set. But there are a couple who made it pretty clear and explicit that they were interested in other things, and they were here doing the unit or doing the course for a breadth of skills. For those students, it was skills they were most interested in. So they were acquiring skills like you would acquire tools in a toolbox. They would do a unit, or in a unit, they would do an assessment task, pick up some skills, put them in the toolbox, and then move on. How they fit into this particular narrative, it's not as clear cut, but there's certainly a bit of difference. And it's worth highlighting that not everyone obviously comes in with that I want to be a clinical psychologist point of view. The ones who do come in often speak the loudest, so maybe that's why we give more attention to them.
So just a second. Yeah, see him, and then John, and then we'll go online. Yeah, go.
Oh, okay. So basically, I'm very interested in the concept of authenticity and assessment, because I even read Dave's paper recently where he said also we need to shift from authentic assessment to authenticity and assessment. But like, is there any guideline or like framework that we can apply to the practice? Because like I read the paper and I was like, yes, this is like a marvelous idea, but like I didn't want to apply it. So then I feel that I didn't know how to apply it. So like, is there some sort of guidelines or framework on how to apply this concept of authenticity and assessment?
In a word, again, no, not that I'm aware of. Well, because authentic assessment is so contentious, right? And it's only very recently that we're seeing this decoupling of authenticity from assessment. So a lot of the work is still quite conceptual, what that looks like. And then me being the psych, I've jumped on psychological authenticity, and so I really try to leverage that in my discipline. How that looks across other disciplines, I have no idea, but I'm sure there's a lot of work to be done and will be done.
I guess that would be very interesting idea just to apply it and see how it goes, because there might be like some other elements as well, or I don't know.
Yeah, well, one of the things we were grappling with was leveraging some early CRADLE work about tightly versus loosely coupled courses to vocational areas, and whether there were some discrepancies, because as Dave pointed out, not 100% of psych students want to become a clinical psychologist. So would it look very different in, let's say, nursing midwifery, where it's much clearer the intent of students enrolling in that course?
John.
Can we unpack that relationship between their professional identities and the intrinsic motivation and the kind of things that are going on there? Because those are very fluid concepts, very fluid things. Do we have any feeling for the way that the relationship between the activities students are doing while they're doing the assessment, lead up to the assessment, the other activities they're doing as part of the course, the other courses that they're doing, the other assessments they're doing, their professional life. How are those influencing the way they perceive the authenticity of their assessment? I mean, in a simple matter, is the activity you do before the assessment affecting the way they see that authenticity of the assessment?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because when we conceived the study, we kept it very tightly within psychology, but come back to the point that there are students in our sample who were studying units very broadly across sciences. So I don't really have an answer to that, in the sense that I don't know how other non-psychology or other elective units might have influenced their perception of authenticity, because we were quite pointed in terms of these 6 core psych units, focusing on those assessment tasks, your experiences with them. Had we, well, I guess what I could say that there was a strong, so some of the students, 6 units being taken across 12 months, we caught some of these students who had just started in the second year. So at that point, those students could offer more reflection of, now I know why I did those units in first year and those assessment tasks to build certain skills for second year. But the same assessment tasks still resonated with them, even though there's perhaps a greater degree of time. I don't know what else they've done in between, so I can't say whether there was a particular criminology assessment task or whether there were some other ones that were quite formative for them. I suspect there will be, knowing the diversity of units available to our students, but I haven't got that data, I guess.
Might go online. So there's just a couple of questions online so far. We'll start with one from Paul Cooper. And Tim, this came from early on in the talk, which I think helps to locate the question. Paul says, basic question here, how can actions ever not be genuine? Aren't they always outcomes of some aspect of the person and hence genuine in that sense? Paul also says, in brackets, I muted this, exclamation mark.
How can actions ever be non-genuine? I guess first and foremost, it would probably depend on context. This is all very subjective to the individual. Dave's point earlier about authentic to whom. So for some students, it might be a question of looking at the intent behind the action. So with the first sort of pilot study that I put forward, the students, when they completed my assessment task, yes, the action of writing their responses and submitting that is genuine to the person, but the intent behind it is not to be truthful about it. They were giving us answers that were non-genuine to the self, and they told us that in the data. So their action in submitting the assessment task was genuine, but the intent behind it was to almost game the system and try and get the best possible mark they anticipated we were looking for in the assessment task.
Take another one from online. This comes from Tom Worthington. And Tom's question here is in the context of work integrated learning. Tom says that at ANU, some of the work integrated learning is ungraded. And they've been discussing doing some more of that ungrading for some time to reduce the stress on the students. And Tom is wondering whether this might reduce their motivation.
By having ungraded assessments? Potentially. It's, as a discipline, we're grappling with that challenge right now, whether we move to something that's ungraded. It would be interesting to know more. Like I can stand here and speculate, but whether that actually holds any value to Tom and his question, I'm not sure. Again, I wonder if it would depend on the assessment task. So hypothetically, as a school, we are considering one of our possible scenarios is moving our entire first year to ungraded pass-fail. What that would look like when we don't change the assessment task per se. So we've got laboratory reports, case analyses. I wonder if students in our data are still so tightly held with those professional psychology identities, irrespective of the grade, might still be inclined and motivated to complete it because of that professional identity. But it poses an interesting question whether they would be more motivated or not. Because there's no external, like when you think of the external or extrinsically motivated, there's no grade for them to be motivated to complete it. It might preference those who are a little bit more intrinsically motivated.
Okay, 2 questions for you first, and then Lisa.
Just have a question about the different, I really liked how you had all those different types of motivations and sort of how that changes from assessment to assessment. That's sort of a static notion. But I'm wondering, can we really sort of categorise them as one, you mentioned as a scale? I would see it more as many motivations in one, that maybe have a predominant one, but it's sort of, you're not usually only have one motivation to do a task.
Absolutely. Psychology is great at creating categories. It's like we like a box with this and this and this and all nice and neat. In reality, it's extremely fluid. It could fluctuate on a daily basis. And I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think I would be fooling myself if I thought, oh, you know, there's just an intrinsically motivated student and an integrated one. I think the reality is we know from health psychology that students who are more intrinsically motivated are going to have more enduring patterns of behaviour and change over time. So in terms of an aspirational point of view, we should be encouraging them more that way. But we all know there'll be assessment tasks where they just want the mark to just get it done. And so that falls into that more external regulated sort of category. Again, then pinning it down at a particular point in time is beyond capacity now.
Thanks, Steve. This is absolutely wonderful. I'm very interested in hearing a bit more about the support that was available for students and what you learned based on the project. So, based on my own experience, both that as a teacher and as a researcher, is that students require quite a bit of support and scaffolding in forensic assessment, particularly for first-year students. And what I found fascinating about your work is that now this support and scaffolding has to move not from the world of learning to professional identity development as well, which obviously overlaps, but it's a bit of a shift. So my question is, what sort of support is available for students in this authentic assessment, scenarios, as they were asked to develop their professional identities or not? And what did you learn based on this project? Or what should we do in authentic assessment to support those processes?
Thanks, Yusuf. Good question again. And you would always get you know, when you're ever coming here, you're always going to get good critical questions. With that one, I think in our school, it would be fair to say that a lot of our assessment tasks are very scaffolded. There's a lot of resources, there's a lot of time that goes into them early on in the piece, partly because we operate at scale, partly because we've been running the school the way we have for so long that we kind of know the pinch points for students. So some of that preliminary work is bedded down. And then again, coming back to Dave's point, some students who are there for the skills will really lean into those resources. So those who are there to identify skills, recognise the learning opportunities to pick up everything from critical research skills, statistical analysis, so on and so forth. What I learnt through the process is many things. I guess one of them is what we think is important is obviously not what students think is important, right? So what we're emphasising, I'm sure it's a cliche, right? Even though it goes to show that if you've done something for a long time, doesn't mean you're good at it or you have the right intent. So I think the reflection is to go back, and certainly this is what I'll do with my school, and coming back to your point at the start, I like straddling this higher education practice continuum so I can take the learnings back to the school and go, well, team, maybe the careers piece in first year, while they get good skills, they're not ready for it. We need to perhaps scaffold them more in terms of this identity piece, give them more opportunities for that introspection and reflection about, well, what do other disciplines look like? Rather than saying, go find a job and seek, maybe it's more about that critical problem addressed from multiple perspectives. So they have greater insight to what it looks like. That I don't think we do particularly well as a discipline. That's what I've learned and would take away.
We are almost at time. Is it a quick one, Jack? All right, go super fast. 1 minute.
Got another question from the same Tom who asked the previous online question, and I think it's related to Yuso's question in some ways. Tom's just wondering, do we help students cope with not being able to do something? And this speaks to the point in your presentation about statistics and the quotes you had about that student there. Tom says, I couldn't cope with statistics and changed my own graduate studies. Did you have any reflections on that in this project?
Do we help students not cope?
To cope.
Do we help
Something.
students? That's a different question then.
Yeah, do we help students cope with not being able to do something?
I'm not sure. I think I'm not giving a quick answer, sorry. I can't speak broadly. I don't want to tread too far beyond my own bounds, and that might not be sufficient for Tom, but I know of the effort that my immediate school, our team does in terms of helping students to cope. I feel like we do provide a lot of buffers and supports, but beyond that, I'm not sure.
So I think now, and I can talk without pulling this down to me, can't I? I think now we've reached time. So I'd like once again to thank Tim for something that really prompts all the difficult questions, like how do we make assessment that matters to everyone? Like matters to us, matters to our students, matters to all our students. Is that just an elusive dream that we're after? But certainly I think we can help them find more meaning and value that perhaps they might otherwise do. So with that, please let's thank Tim. We can stay around for some more conversations. If people need to leave now, feel free. If you want to, drop off online or stay on, it's up to you. And once again, a reminder, we're going to have a series of AI assessment learnings from the CRADLE in the next couple of months. So thanks again for your time. No, you had a question.
It's a bit of a long-winded, curly one. It's not a comment, it is a question. So bear with me. I was thinking about assessment of learning versus for learning and what authenticity in assessment might mean in those two different modes. The reason I was thinking about this is because of all the discussion around pass grade only, and also thinking about the student stories I've heard about people who have got into psychology. They want to become a psychologist, and they are, maybe the first in family to come to university. Maybe they've got a lot of things on their plate. They are, they see P's get degrees. I'm going to pass. I'm going to get the skills. I'm going to be able to go on. But they discover somewhere through the process that the assessment of learning bit means that unless they get that HD, they can't even get through to the next gate. And so I wondered, do you, perhaps from that perspective, is there a benefit of pass grade only in certain situations? Would that make a difference? And back to that question about the authenticity in of versus for.
I'll have to contemplate the of versus for in more detail. The question about grades, we did ask, there were some instances where we prompted, are you doing this for grades? Because if you don't know psychology, it's inherently competitive. So we'll have 2,500 students in first year, and maybe we'll take 200, 250 in fourth year, and they have to do fourth year in order to be eligible for postgraduate study. And you can only become a registered psychologist if you do postgraduate study in Australia. Short story. So the pipeline starts very broad and gets very narrow very, very quickly. And at some point in time, every student who wants to, or who's entertaining thought down that pipeline is very aware of grades. And I think the tension for me is how can we do this meaningfully against that backdrop of, but everyone's here just to get HDs. And Dave's point again about, well, what about those non-psych students? If we focus on one, are we then disadvantaging another who are here for a broader degree and aren't necessarily that competitive if we focus just on those who are, and that's the training model we have, then we might be forgetting about the vast majority who have just got a wonderful 3-year degree and who are going elsewhere with it. It's a messy space. And then for us as a discipline, sorry, I'll get to your question in a second, psychology nationally is undergoing federal review. So we've just signed, or when I say we, one of our key stakeholders has signed a contract with the federal government. We're undertaking a 2-year review. By the end of next year, we as a discipline have to make recommendations about what the training model will look like for 2027 and beyond, because we know federal government want to increase the workforce and were notoriously bad and slow at producing psychologists. So it's kind of the slap in the wrist to hurry up. So we have, pieces of work like this, challenges around grades, those who don't want grades but just want a psychology degree. How does it all fit together? I don't know.
Is there a solution with School of IT's on-track system?
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, you choose what grade you want.
Okay.
Therefore, what you do for that. And so that's been running for some time with School of IT. We've worked with it as well. So students who wanted, whether in that competitive would be choosing to go for the HDs, the rest would just be going for passes or whatever else they want. And so you're giving control from students, but then you're actually telling them what they have to do to actually achieve that, making it much more explicit.
It certainly presents as an alternative model that we would need to consider. I've not heard of that before. So.
Like the ultimate competency-based program where you demonstrate that you can do the thing, then
yep.
There are higher levels of difficulty.
There are higher levels of
So you had to do one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just a quick comment to continue the conversation. It would probably be quite lovely for you to, in the future, to reach beyond this more psychological view and look at these different complex systems that influence assessment, authenticity of assessment. Because this conversation is quite lovely and would be quite cool to see this more in authentic assessment literature as well.
Yeah, certainly.
I mean, a brief comment on what John was saying about contracting for grades. There was a big push for that about 20, 30 years ago, and it lost its momentum because it trapped students in the situation of going for a low grade and then realising later that they really wanted to succeed in the area, and they were trapped by their own decisions. So there's a kind of moral dilemma in grade contracting. The question I wanted to ask,
with on track, you can adjust your contract.
Yeah, you can, and we have students doing that.
Yeah.
Actually, interestingly enough, they don't do that much. The group that we're working with don't.
Anyway, the question I want to ask is about, you talked a lot about identity formation and the fact that they've all got this aspiration to become a psychologist. And in a sense, your take on authenticity is to kind of buy into their aspiration in a way by having tasks that feed that aspiration. But you've also said that most of them aren't going to make the cut. So how do you deal with this dilemma of, in a sense, utilising their aspirations, which can't possibly be fulfilled in the long run, as a device to get them engaged right now?
I think this is where I think I was unexpected in terms of these findings. So as the practitioner, the introduction of those alternative applied assessment tasks was there to try and de-emphasize the professional identity and help students realise that there are other options available. There's some data in the data set that I haven't reported today where we have a couple of units that largely teach these assessment tasks or have them. And informally, the purpose of these units is to say, hey, look, there's 2,000 you in the room, maybe only 50 of you will go through. And for some, the students in the data set say, oh, that was like a cold bucket of water on the head. They didn't realise that was me. And rather than there being this moment of recognition, like, oh, okay, so I'll invest in these career assessment tasks and look at my other options, it was more like doubling down of, okay, then it's me. So I better be one of the ones who are going through. I will confess, like, we might not have the full representative sample of everyone. The nature of the question, the project might have attracted those who were more inclined to have a stronger kind of professional identity. Yeah.
I was mulling. I've been mulling all the way through this talk and this conversation about the role of the student identity and where that sits. Because we're talking a lot about professional identity, but a lot of the time students come also with a student identity.
Mm.
And so I was wondering, as we were talking about, you know, I was thinking about the genre of doing research reports. We're intensely familiar. You know, it's almost a genre of going into, you know, when you're a student, you go to university, you go to tutorials, you go to lectures, you do research reports, and you sit in exam. This is what your world is. So I guess I was thinking about that imagined world of being a student, and I wonder if, and this is just me thinking out loud, is I wonder if perhaps some of our targeting professional identity, it makes sense when people are going to come out to be something like a teacher or a nurse, you know, you start, so there's an absolute smooth transition. But in a degree like this, there's also a sense of, and what's confusing about this degree is it purports to be one of those degrees, but actually,
yes.
And I wonder if it might be easier actually also just to tell people that they're students as well, and to try and give them some meaning within the student identity that allows them then to make alternate choices. And maybe if you go for a gradeless first year, that could be one of the things that goes on there while you're making up your mind or while you're experiencing it. Because these are first years and they don't even, they're trying to be psychologists before they've even learned about going to university.
Yeah. Well, and I probably skipped over the one quote, but there was one student who was like, what if I get this wrong? What if, you know, it could be life-threatening if I get this diagnosis wrong. And they're in first year. We haven't even touched anything of substance around clinical treatment and practice, but they're just thinking, but if I get this wrong now, this means I won't be able to practice. So they've got these really strong identities that are a make or break in first year. So I think as a discipline, we need to reflect upon what's of value in first year. You know, really, all we're doing is just helping students double down on the identity rather than actually encouraging them to think a bit more broadly.
So
I apologise, this is a partly formed thought rather than a fully formed one and a question around it, but you've emphasised several times that psychology isn't a vocational degree. There's this really strong drive to get a vocational qualification at the end for many students, this clin psych rather than psych. So if you're trying to create something authentic to the science of psychology rather than that vocation, you're trying to create assessments that are authentic to the science, then are grades in that a valid way of choosing who gets to go into clin psych? Can they be decoupled? Do they have any predictability as to who actually is going to be a great clin psych? And if you can't get good grades in this, does that mean that you shouldn't get to go into clin psych? So as you address authenticity in that first part, how does that affect how you choose people for getting into the second part? It's
a challenge that I know our postgrad team are grappling with now, because selections open in a couple of months' time, and so often the debate is we look at grades. That doesn't necessarily align with good practice, and so I was in a meeting on Monday last week about that very thing, less about the authenticity, but more about how we actually choose and select our students. I don't know the answer to the question. What I can say is that as a discipline, I think we're grappling with these issues. Like, you know, I've certainly questioned what we do in first year based on the data that I found, and I can only imagine how that would extrapolate across the entire course sequence, you know, first right through to fifth, sixth year. I wonder if we have, been so wedded to the idea of a grade, a mark. And as discussions have had elsewhere, what is the difference between a 75 and a 76? Can we be so sure we know the difference?
And Sue and I were in a meeting yesterday, Monday. Were you there with Lambert? Yes. And Lambert said, oh, well, we think we should go back to the Netherlands system and have a lottery to see if it's in because it's fairer and, you know,
If you meet the standard.
it meets the standards, it's easier than doing all the other choosing, and you won't have any of your biases coming.
Yep.
So there's always a lottery.
I'll take that back to the school.
You know, we've solved the grading problem altogether, we're just going to have a lottery. So I think we might bring this to a close now. Please feel free, people who are here in person, we've got to a 38 online, but people who are in person, feel free to hang around, have a cup of tea, chat to Tim. Thank you all for your thoughts and your participation. It's a really interesting topic, and one of the reasons it's interesting is it's sort of just sticky. But I think what's exciting is that you're grappling with this in practice and making decisions that will iteratively sort of tap away at the sorts of challenges that I think we have in front of us. And I'm also really reminded of the thing that that's such a simple thing, that asking students just can be so revelatory of something that the thing that they are thinking or where they're coming from is really not what you thought they would be thinking and where they're coming from. What a good thing it is to have that challenge and to throw things up.
Indeed.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, and